now you're live.
Hello, what?
I'm just going to hold it like this because I'm not going to be speaking for very long.
Where's that coming from?
Okay, so please leave the voice from above or the walls just said to please not touch the buttons in front of you, because if more than one go on at the same time, there's a problem with the recording. That's my understanding. So thanks everybody for coming out today. I'm Laurie Hansen, newly minted director of the Division of Social Accountability, which is sponsoring this event today, together with several other organizations. Today's a really active and busy day on campus with an awful lot going on, so I really appreciate people coming out to this. Our sponsors today, beyond the Division of Social Accountability, include the Indigenous Health Committee of the College of Medicine, the Indigenous Students Council, and the Treaty 6 Justice Collective, which operates the space behind Turning the Tide bookstore called The Stand. We're going to start hopefully in a good way today. I'm asking Regan Rat-Misponas, who's the president of the Indigenous Students Council, to welcome Nick to Treaty 6, and then we'll be following that up with an opening prayer from our very own Saskatchewan Poet Laureate, Elder Louise Half, who has graciously agreed to open the session. So I'm talking really briefly and quickly here because we have such a limited time in this room. So when we've had some welcomes to this territory, we will commence with a quick introduction of Nick and into his talk. So thank you and welcome.
Okay. That voice from above, holy. I like that guy. Tansaniwa kumantik, Regan Rat Mispanas ni Sikasun, Minehikwas Kahigan Sagahigan Kutsinia. My name is Regan Rat Mispanas, and I come from a small community in northern Saskatchewan called Pinehouse Lake. And it is a pleasure to be joined by each of the people that are in this room, and a pleasure to welcome our wonderful guest, our esteemed guest, Mr. Nick Estes. It is a pleasure to have you. Welcome to Treaty 6 territory. We acknowledge that we are on the lands of Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. I look forward to the day that this is not only just an acknowledgement, but is something that we practice more and more in this territory. That's something that we need to move towards, practicing that we live on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you very much for being a part of this wonderful event. Because of each of you, we have the wonderful opportunity to listen to such an amazing speaker and an amazing activist and an amazing author and academic as well. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nick, and I want to give you a big welcome on behalf of our Indigenous students that are here. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay? Newatski Sikamokani mi tuaksini and Sigasun onis now I've forgotten how to say my Cree Reserve. It's a really hard one too. But my Cree name is loosely translated into Sky Dancer. I just want to tell you a brief story about writing. And because I'm a poet, I have 5 books out, and I'm going on 6. And but a long time ago in my 20s, I had a dream about my writing career. But at the time, I didn't pay much attention to it because when you're 20, you're still trying to find yourself. And then I went into ceremony with my elders back home. I've done many, many vision quests, and they gave me my spiritual name, and they told me that my journey in life was to write. And so ever since that time, I have celebrated and gone into meditation, because that's what we do as writers. We meditate, we go into ceremony when we're writing, when we're spending a lot of time researching and talking to the great mystery to provide us with the wisdom that we need to put on paper. And so my prayer today, I already said them this early this morning. I get up at between 5 and 6 in the morning to write. And I always say my prayers before then, but I'm going to say them again, and I want to dedicate this to all the writers, and especially to Nick today, because he's traveled a long way. And I'm going to pray that his work will travel and open eyes to the greater public, so that we're all enriched with the story that he's unfolded for all of the benefit of humanity. Mama wihtawi no kumate gonna kiwa ga te peitzege ka waskama pik buguite. Kinaskum na wa semina anotska gisaka pimatsune miya hiawihia petama. Kapmutea humaski kapewa patama piseme minaya. Aski wa yutin kamusehaya kayehia kwase minaya nipi. Kam nai koa poki koa isnipi ep machi tad. Nenaskumawa wa ne kaisiga so de pepik squata wa hanots. Kamiu pemute opuguite kan tutawak ay sinuwak tansi sa kawitwet. Nenaskumananos ka kapmute anis na namamawitawinan. Magigo imstahin ngskate magagepi anis na yagamemoyan. Iwa paskuna manoma. Ka pikskoya mana kaneyo yung kinaskum tinamama witawina no kumateo kan kia mina sagi tung ka pewa pata magawi hay. Thank you.
Thank you kindly to Regan and especially to Elder Louise for the very wise words. Much appreciated. Some people will have read this a bit about Nick on our poster, and perhaps some of you have even taken it further and read a little bit from some things that he writes. Nick is a citizen of the Lower Sioux Brule tribe, is an assistant professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico, and is a co-founder of the Red Nation. He's recently authored the brilliant book that is featured, and I see Regan had a copy, you can flash it, the full title is Our History is the Future, No Dapple, Standing Rock, and the Long Traditions of Indigenous Resistance. Peter Garden, you want to flash from Turning the Tide, is selling these books outside we'll be selling them right after this talk. If you're curious about the story that's going to, I think, feature probably pretty largely in today's talk, that's laid out in that book. And I think we're really fortunate, really lucky actually, that we were able to luck on to a book tour. This book was only actually made available as of March, what did you say, March 6th or something? 5th, yeah, so it's really hot off the press. And Nick has just come from a full day in Toronto, another full day in Winnipeg. He's here for a full day of events in Saskatoon, including this evening. If you're curious, there'll be another talk related, but not the same, at Station 20 at 7 o'clock. So you can let your friends know. And tomorrow we'll be going on to Regina for talks there. So we're really fortunate to have Nick with us, and welcome and thank you again. And the stage is yours. And use the mic, apparently.
Hamataki api nape chuzapi chante washte machapi te tanko hitika. What I said is just thank you, and I greet each and one of you with a handshake and an open heart, and thank you for the welcoming onto Treaty 6 territory, but also the territory of the original caretakers of this land. And I was having a conversation earlier about this word indigenization, because I thought it was coming from the ground up, but it's coming from the top down. And so I was thinking, I was like, so what does it really mean to indigenize an academy or the university? And it would be, in my opinion, restoring the land back to the original caretakers and some of the people, the nations in this room right now. So, but I don't know if that's the intent of this university, but it should be. Okay. Here's a copy of the book, what it looks like, the cover. I'm just going to start with a scene, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the context of this book. In the aftermath of the October 27, 2016 raid on 1851 Treaty Camp, blockading the Dakota Access Pipeline, a rancid smell permeated the camps. Police and private security had heaped the camp's remnants, ceremonial items such as eagle feathers, pipes, medicine bundles, and staves, along with mangled tents, sleeping bags, clothing, and teepees, into a large pile near the entrance of Ochete Shawkoe Camp. Cops and private security had urinated on the items before returning them. One night after it was decided to ceremonially burn the urine-soaked remnants, an Ihanktawa elder gathered young water protectors around a fire. She was dressed in the regalia she wore the day of the raid. Hundreds of copper pennies hung by red ribbons from her dark blue trade cloth dress. She told of her ancestors who were killed during the U.S. Dakota War. Evicted from their homelands, they fled to present-day Standing Rock, crossing the Missouri River not far from the location of Ochete Shawkoe Camp, after U.S. cavalrymen massacred Dakotas and Lakotas in the Whitestone Hill Buffalo Hunt Camp. This was, to the day, exactly 150 years before Dakota Access Private Security unleashed attack dogs on unarmed water protectors at a nearby pipeline construction site. The day after Christmas in 1862, soldiers gathered up 38 Dakota men and boys and imprisoned them at Fort Snelling in Mankato or Makato, Minnesota. Their medicine bundles were confiscated, heaped in a large pile, and burned as they were led to the gallows, singing their death songs. Their crime? Defending their nation and homelands. The same week that President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation freeing black slaves, he also signed the death sentences of 38 Dakota patriots. The copper pennies hanging from the elder's regalia had holes drilled into Lincoln's ears with red ribbon threaded through. He didn't listen, she said of the great emancipator, so he opened his ears. This is a picture of her. And after 1876 Battle of Greasy Grass, Lakota women used awls to carve holes in Custer's ears so he would hear better in the afterlife. Now it was President Barack Obama, North Dakota Governor Jack Dalrymple, and Morton County Sheriff Kyle Kirchmeier who refused to listen. As singers began a prayer song, the elder reminded the younger ones that the tears flowing from their eyes were their ancestors speaking through them, and that they were not tears of trauma, but of liberation. We survived genocide after genocide, she said. And then she danced, and the penny swayed with the flickering fire and billowing smoke. Behind her, armed police were perched on a hill, half a mile away, and their bright floodlights glared down on us. Our history is the future. So this is a picture of that scene. These are the floodlights. I know some of you have been to the camps, but this was after the raid on the camp. It's kind of like Close Encounters of the Colonial Kind. So this book explores the movement to protect the Missouri River, marching under the banner Mni Wiconi, or in our language, water is life. How did it emerge, and how does settler colonialism, a key element of U.S. history and also Canadian history, continue to inform our present? No DAPL, which was the banner, the hashtag that the movement came to be known as, and Mni Wiconi are part of a longer history of Indigenous resistance against the trespass of settlers, dams, and oil pipelines across Minnesota, what we call the Missouri River. The Ochete Shawkoe, or the Nakota, Lakota, and Dakota nations, our relationship to Minnesota and our historic struggle for liberation are fundamentally tied to our prior history of Indigenous nationhood and political authority. This book is less a story about objects, individuals, and ideas than it is a history of relationships, those between the Oceti-Sakowin, Mni Wiconi, and the United States as an occupying power. By focusing on these relationships, we can see that Indigenous history is not a narrow subfield of U.S. history, or the history of capitalism or imperialism. Rather, Indigenous peoples are central subjects of modern world history. This is not simply an examination of the past. Like No Dapple, Mni Wiconi, and Mni Wiconi, what I call traditions of Indigenous resistance have far-reaching implications, extending beyond the world that is normally understood as just Indigenous. A tradition is usually defined as a static or unchanging practice. This view often suggests that Indigenous culture or tradition doesn't change over time, that Indigenous peoples are trapped in the past and thus have no future. But as colonialism changes throughout time, so too does resistance to it. By drawing upon earlier struggles and incorporating elements of them into their own experience, each generation continues to build dynamic and vital traditions of resistance. Such collective experiences build up over time and are grounded in specific Indigenous territories and nations. For the Oceti-Sakowin, the affirmation, Mni Wiconi, or water is life, relates to wotakuye, or being a good relative. Indigenous resistance to the trespass of settlers, pipelines, and dams is part of being a good relative to the water, land, and animals, not to mention the human world. So contrast this with the actions of energy transfer partners, the financial backers of the Dakota Axis, or DAPL, and of capitalism more broadly, which seeks above all else to extract profits from the land and all forms of life. This is not to suggest that Indigenous societies possess the solution to climate change, and in fact, many Indigenous nations actively participate in resource extraction and capitalist economies in order to strengthen their own self-determination. But in its best moments, No Dapple showed us a future that becomes possible when everyday Native people take control of their own destinies and lands, while drawing upon their own traditions of resistance. I'm interested in the kind of tradition of Indigenous resistance that is a radical consciousness, both anti-capitalist and anti-colonial, and is deeply embedded in history and place, one that expresses the ultimate desire for freedom. This region, our homeland, is also part of a Chesapa, the Black Hills, or the heart of everything that is. Chesapa is the beating heart of the Lakota cosmos, where we emerged from Red Earth, took our first breath, and gained our humanity as Oyate Luta, or the Red People, or the Red Nation. During the last ice age, massive glaciers carved up the land, and after the ice retreated, it left rolling hills and tunneling valleys that became buffalo roads, where herds that once blackened the plains traveled during seasonal migrations to and from water. The buffalo followed the stars, and the people followed the buffalo. To honor our relations, we called ourselves P'te Oyate, the Buffalo Nation, and Wichachpi Oyate, the Star Nation. In these ebbs and flows of migration, all roads led to Mni Wiconi, which translates to roiling water for the once astir and often muddy river. So if Chesapa is the heart of the world, then Mni Wiconi is its aorta. This is a Lakota and Indigenous relationship to the physical world. What has been derided for centuries as primitive superstition has only recently been discovered by Western scientists and academics as valid knowledge. Nevertheless, knowledge alone has never ended imperialism. So the US military understood this vital connection to place and other than humans in the 1860s when it annihilated the remaining 10 million buffaloes in less than 2 decades. A century later, another branch of the military, the US Army Corps of Engineers, constructed 5 earthen-rolled dams on the main stem of the Missouri River, turning life-giving waters into life-taking waters. A river that was once astir was now choked and plugged. After World War II, the United States also aimed to get out of the Indian business, to terminate federal responsibilities to Indigenous peoples that had been guaranteed through treaties, to relocate Indigenous peoples off their reservations, and to sell off remaining lands and resources to private industry and white settlers. The 1944 Pick Sloan Plan a basin-wide multi-purpose dam project which aimed to provide post-war employment, hydroelectricity, flood control, and irrigation to white farming communities in far-off cities, worked in tandem with Indian termination and relocation. With the flooding of the fertile river bottomlands, people were forced off the reservation. Remaining lands were largely uninhabitable, making relocation the only option for many. 30%, or about 1/3 of Missouri River reservation populations were removed. 90% of commercial timber was destroyed. Thousands of acres, I don't know what that translates into hectares, of acres of subsistence farms and gardens were flooded, and 75% of wildlife and plants indigenous to the river bottomlands disappeared. So this is a picture of our old headquarters. It looks like a beautiful river, but actually our old headquarters sit underwater right now. And I show this picture because a lot of people came to our homelands and commented on the natural beauty of the landscape. And I always had to remind them, I was like, well, it's an altered landscape, right? And one of the things that most impacted our world at this particular time, much like a lot of northern communities here, we largely subsisted off of the land, hunting, fishing, growing our own food, gathering medicines, etc., right? And that statistic I read wasn't our statistic, about 75% of our wildlife being destroyed. It was actually the statistic from the government itself. They went out and counted every single head of deer and how many disappeared after the flooding of the river because this water became undrinkable, right? And they also calculated how much calories we consumed and what kind of calories we consumed and where we got those calories from, right? And so after the construction of these dams, we lost our food source and they began the ration system, right? White bread or white flour, white sugar, white milk, etc. And so prior to the dams, there was no such thing as diabetes. After the dams, diabetes shot through the roof, right? So Oglala visionary and prophet Nicholas Black Elk, himself a Catholic, compared the invasion of white Christians as akin to the biblical flood. But unlike the Genesis flood that receded after 150 days, Black Elk's apocalyptic deluge had no end. It had worked continuously to eliminate indigenous peoples and their other than human relatives from the land, thereby severing their relationship with the land. According to the vision Black Elk described to poet John Neidhart in 1931, white men came like an endless wall of floodwater, creating a little island or a reservation, where we were free to try to save our nation, but we couldn't do it, he said. Constantly hounded as fugitives, escaping from one dry patch of land to the next, the people, quote, were always leaving our lands, and the flood devours the four-leggeds as they flee. The four-leggeds were bears, elk, deer, buffaloes, wolves, and so forth, some of whom are presently extinct in the lands of the Oceti-Sakowin. The Department of Interior is tasked with managing the diminished lands and territories of both wildlife and Indians, survivors of an ongoing Holocaust. All of our religion of the old times that the early Indians had was left behind them as they fled, and the water covered the region, Black Elk lamented. Now, as I look ahead, we are nothing but prisoners of war. Over the last 200 years, the U.S. military has waged relentless war on the Oceti-Sakowin as much as it has on our kinship relations, such as the P'teo-Yate, the Buffalo Nation, and Mni Wiconi, the Missouri River. And what happened at Standing Rock was a most recent iteration of an Indian war that never ends. DAPL was originally meant to cross the Missouri River upstream from Bismarck, a city that is 90% white, but the Army Corps rerouted it to cross downstream, citing a shorter route, fewer water crossings, and a reduced proximity to residential areas. Now it crossed just upriver, or just upstream from an 84% native residential area, i.e. Standing Rock, a suggestion made not by Dakota Access, but by the Army Corps, which went so as far to guide companies funding the pipeline to create environmental justice studies that would find, quote, no disproportionate risk to a racial minority, as if there's ever a proportionate risk. In fact, the Army Corps had made one of the main driving forces behind choking the Missouri River after World War II. In 1946, without authorization from Congress, the Army Corps modified the Garrison Dam project to protect the small majority white town of Williston, North Dakota, which later became an oil and gas boom town, from flooding. Nothing was done, however, to protect against the flooding of the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation. The dam flooded 150,000 acres of reservation land, dislocating 325 families, or 80% of the tribal membership, and destroying 94% of their agricultural lands. In 1955, the Army Corps selected the Big Bend Dam site on Lower Brule and Crow Creek reservation lands without notifying either tribal council. 6 different sites were considered, 4 of which would not have flooded the agency town of Lower Brule. And the reservation site was chosen for hydraulic reasons, but also because its location wouldn't flood the upriver town of Pierre, the white-dominated state capital of South Dakota, or its neighboring town of Fort Pierre. Big Bend Dam flooded and dislocated both reservation communities for the second time. So we were they built 2 dams on our river, flooding us out twice, making us relocate twice. The first one flooded a little bit, the next one flooded the rest of the land, forcing some families, including my own, who had moved to higher ground or relocate yet again. The first flood took out the Crow Creek Agency, the combined headquarters of Crow Creek and Lower Brule, and a quarter of Lower Brule's population was removed during the first deluge and a half during the second. So this is a picture I thought was really fitting. It kind of reminds you of an old-timey photograph. It's taken by one of my friends, Yadika Fields. It's the Veterans March to the barricades, the police barricades, when they closed down Highway 1506 or 1806. And what's interesting about this is it kind of reminded me of some of the photographs of the Wounded Knee Massacre. But in this case, we have the U.S. military is on our side fighting its own government, right? And I thought this was a really powerful statement that all of these military veterans had come out to support and act as human shields for not just Standing Rock, but the Ocheti Shakoi. This is a picture of my grandparents. My grandfather, my direct grandfather is all the way on your left, the guy that's standing up, the tall guy. So my grandparents, Joyce and Andrew Estes, both Kluichasha from Lower Brule, fought the construction of the Pixlone dams in the 1950s and 1960s. The dams flooded nearly all of my great-grandmother Cornelia Shawala's allotment. My grandfather, a World War II veteran, and according to my father Ben, a Lakota code talker, returned from the war to find his homelands and nation under threat from the very government he fought to defend. Our lands and lives were targeted not because they held precious resources or labor to be extracted. In fact, the opposite was true. Our lands and lives were targeted and held value because they could be wasted, submerged, and destroyed. Grandpa Andrew, nicknamed Brown for his dark complexion, later gifted his mother Cornelia's remaining allotted lands to the Lower Brule Sioux tribe so that our nation could rebuild the inundated Lower Brule town site. In 1937, my great-grandfather Reuben Estes, Cornelia's husband and the first tribal chairman, opposed the state of South Dakota's attempt to build dams on the Missouri River without our consent. The old ones called Reuben Tongue because after butchering his cattle, he gave away all the meat to elders and the hungry, keeping only the tongues for himself. My ancestors were tribal historians, writers, intellectuals, and fierce indigenous nationalists at a time when Indians weren't supposed to be anything but drunk, stupid, or dead. They were also water protectors, treaty defenders, and humble people of the earth, and they fought for and took care of Minnesota as best they could. So in 1971, my grandfather, George Estes, with Richard Loader, co-wrote Kluichasha Oyate, a more extensive history of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. And my grandfather, Andrew, who had an 8th grade education, wrote in the preface of that book what would have been a fitting epigraph for the book, for my book, about our nation's history of the defense of our land, our water, and people. Quote, "My people's history has been lost or destroyed since the coming of the white man. My people in many ways have been lost and destroyed by the coming of the white man. This book is not the whole story of my people, nor is it all that is best in our heritage. Some of our traditions, our hopes, and our roots we will never write down for the world to see. What we will allow the world to see is, in good part, in these pages. Read them, my brothers, and you, white man, you read them too. It is a history of a proud people, a people who believe in the land and themselves. My people were civilized when the white man came, or before the white man came, and we will be civilized and be here after the white man goes away, poisoned by his misuse of the land and eaten up by his own greed and diseases, end quote. So just to kind of give you an idea, this is the old town site, what it used to look like. And just notice that island that's coming out of the river and all those trees that are on that island. The Army Corps of Engineers paid us per tree, right? And after they compensated us for those trees, they said that we couldn't go out and cut them. And so in this next photograph, you can see they just flooded that island with all of those trees still there. Because at that time, we still used wood, to cook and to eat and to keep warm. But that happened with a lot of the things that were destroyed along the river, even the archaeological sites and the ceremonial sites as well. In September of 2016, at a No Dapo protest in Chicago, organized by the Native community and groups such as Black Lives Matter, I told this family history in front of a crowd of thousands outside the Army Corps headquarters. My ancestors could never have imagined that thousands, or perhaps millions, would one day rally to defend the river, a relative, Mni. Half a century ago, there were no mass protests against the dams that still wreak havoc on our river. And as we marched, a light rain fell. Tell me what the prophecy looks like, we chanted. This is what the prophecy looked like. And it was prophecy. Prophecy told of Zuzecha Sapa, the black snake, extending itself across the land and imperiling all life, beginning with the water. From its heads, or many heads, it would spew death and destruction. Zuzecha Sapa, the black snake, is dapple, and all oil pipelines trespassing through indigenous territory. But while the black snake prophecy foreshadows doom, it also foreshadows historic resistance and resurgent indigenous histories not seen for generations, if ever. To protect Unchi Maka, our grandmother earth, indigenous and non-indigenous people will have to unite to turn back the forces destroying the earth, capitalism and colonialism. But prophets and prophecies do not predict the future, nor are they mystical or ahistorical occurrences. They are simply diagnoses of the times in which we live and visions of what must be done to get free. In the past, youth followed the guidance of indigenous elders, the old ones, but in these prophetic times, it is the old ones who are following the leadership of the young, the youth leaders of the No Dapo movement, among them Zaisha Grinnell, Bobby Jean Three Legs, Jacelyn Charger, and Joseph White Eyes, among others, who brought the message of the Black Snake to the world through 1,000-mile relay runs from April to July of 2016. So for the Ocheti Shakoi, prophecies like the Black Snake are revolutionary theory, a way to help us think about a relationship to the land, to other humans, and other than humans, and to history and time. How does one relate to the past? Settler narratives use a linear conception of time to distance themselves from the horrific crimes committed against indigenous peoples and the land. But indigenous notions of time consider the present to be structured entirely by our past and by our ancestors. There is no separation between past and present, meaning that an alternative future is also determined by our understanding of the past. Concepts such as Mni Wiconi, water is life, may be new to some, but like the nation of people the concept belongs to, Mni Wiconi predates and continues to exist in spite of white supremacist empires like the United States. At Greasy Grass on June 25th, 1876, Lakotas, Cheyennes, and Arapahoes blew out the birthday candles a week before the United States celebrated its 100 years of liberty. The Plains Indigenous Alliance annihilated Custer and 268 of his men. Custer had launched the surprise attack on the large encampment to kill Indians and to force them back onto the reservations. In a perfect expression of the settler state's death culture. The indigenous encampment was, in contrast to life culture, celebrating the annual renewal of life with a Sundance. Indigenous peoples from reservations had slipped away to join their relatives at the camp and enjoy a brief taste of freedom. U.S. history books and popular culture typically depict the battle as Custer's last stand. The very earth seemed to grow Indians, Colonel Marcus Reno later reported, running toward me in swarms and from all directions. Put simply, they were surrounded. In their book, The Undercommons, Fred Moten and Stefano Harney draw from Michael Parenti's anti-imperialist study of Hollywood films, which always portray colonization as upside down. Invasion looks like self-defense, and the settlers hiding in their militarized forts are the real victims of an encircling native aggression. Such a reversal of roles in which aggressor becomes victim is a make-believe national narrative that began when settlers first invaded indigenous lands in North America and repeats itself every time the United States invades or bombs another country in its overseas imperial project. Yet Moten and Harney argue that it is simultaneously very much true that the settler is, in a way, surrounded and outnumbered. While indigenous peoples have been rendered a statistical minority within their own homelands, the power of indigenous lifeways and resistance has always surrounded settlers in North America, along with the tenuous claims to land. The perpetual threat of indigenous nations is that they are a reminder of the settlers' own precarious claims to land and belonging. So ancestors of indigenous resistance didn't merely fight against settler colonialism. They fought for indigenous life and just relations with human and non-human relatives and with the earth. When Custer and his men descended on the Sundance at Greasy Grass, the ancestors were dancing, as they have since time immemorial. In 2016, as construction of the Black Snake began, they danced again, this time on the shores of Oceti Camp and at Sacred Stone, to protect Mni and Unchi. Indigenous resistance is not a one-time event. It continually asks what proliferates in the absence of empire. Thus it defines freedom not as the absence of settler colonialism, but the amplified presence of indigenous life and just relations with human and non-human relatives and with the earth. To invoke Ganawage Mohawk scholar Audra Simpson, the refusal to accept the impossible condition of banishment and disappearance from one's own homelands and outright dispossession structures the indigenous political practice of return, restoration, and reclamation of belonging in place. Like the Army Corps, and often working alongside them, the planners of the Dakota Access Pipeline imagined building a pipeline in a world where Native people did not exist. And they actually, in the maps that they created, they actually erased indigenous territories and boundaries. And they had to imagine us out of existence to justify trespassing on indigenous territory and protected treaty lands. So when the pipeline risked interfering with white residential areas in Bismarck, it was rerouted such that the danger of water contamination was outsourced to downriver Native nation of Standing Rock. So when DAPL sought protection of its private property and investments, the rights of way across the land, police and private security stepped in on their behalf, imagining indigenous peoples as the threat. These were modern-day settlers surrounded by an indigenous-led uprising. And DAPL's trespass through unceded treaty territory and the militarized crackdown on water protectors was made to look like self-defense. Settlers in the fort surrounded by hostile natives. And I thought this picture was really fitting. For those of you that were there, you can see the helicopter that was always circling above camp right over there. This was called Turtle Island, not North America Turtle Island, but this was once this is a burial actually, and the police used it as a staging ground to sort of surveil the camp from a high position, and you can see water protectors trying to reclaim that territory. But I thought it was a really kind of like perfect expression of like the camps themselves, that these police are like kind of surrounded on, or acting as if they were surrounded on all sides. Police, military, and private security set up their own bases of operation and planned their own operations to wage low-level warfare against the prayer camps. In released emails by the watchdog website Muckrock, officers shared a FEMA, which stands for Federal Emergency Management Agency, Field of Force Operations Manual, which guided police officers in correct crowd control methods, pain compliance techniques, and application of riot control agents, including chemical weapons and projectiles such as rubber bullets and beanbag rounds. These non-lethal, quote-unquote, weapons were deployed against unarmed water protectors with ritualistic brutality, taking 2 individuals' eyesights and 1 woman's arm, while wounding and traumatizing countless others. The connections were clear based on these emails because they were referencing the tactics that were employed by border control agents against people crossing the border, the US-Mexico border, as well as the tactics used against unarmed black protesters in Ferguson and Baltimore, as well as Israeli Defense Force tactics used against Palestinians. That the local law enforcement and private security imagined themselves as participating in a global counterinsurgency against civilian populations that extended from Palestine to Baltimore, Ferguson, the US-Mexico border, and now Standing Rock. The warrior was against black life, Palestinian life, migrant life, and native life. The tactics employed by Tiger Swan, the murky mercenary security contractor hired by DAPL, were also confirmation that this was a global war. The security company had cut its teeth in the United States' never-ending war on terror, in which it was deployed to run counterinsurgency operations against civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan. Tiger Swan now applied the same techniques to water protectors, and The Intercept reports that they frequently referred to water protectors as terrorists, planned prayer actions as attacks, and camps as a battlefield. They also tracked the presence of water protectors of Middle Eastern descent, noting specifically the presence of Palestinians. But in the orientation pamphlet for new camp arrivals to the No DAPL camp was a hand-drawn map of the site. Roads were named after Indigenous revolutionary heroes such as Red Cloud and Red Warrior Society. And Indigenous nations such as my own nation set up our own national camps. It showed where to get food, medical care, and camp supplies, and this reflected the values of the new community. And for all its faults, there's something to be learned from the treaty camps. Free food, free education, free healthcare, free legal aid, a strong sense of community, safety, and security were guaranteed to all. Most reservations in the United States don't have access to these services, nor do most poor people. Yet in the absence of empire, people came together to help each other, to care for one another. And the No DAPL camps were designed according to need and not profit. That's what separated them from the world of cops, settlers, and oil pipelines, and surrounded them. So in this case, I'm going to skip ahead because I'm running out of time. But I want to think a little bit about, let's go through the next slide, these networks of solidarity with the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. This was a map of where the protesters came from who were arrested by Morton County, and it was used to kind of like criminalize us. And we thought it was really cool because we were like, look at all this support. There's even some folks from Canada that came down and they were actually arrested in the protests themselves. But they said, look at all the out-of-state agitators. This is what we call like our infrastructure of indigenous resistance, right? Contrasted against this infrastructure of settler colonialism. And if you look, you can see where the Alberta tar sands are. I'm sure you all know where that is. You know, if Dakota Access Pipeline is the Black Snake, then the snake pit is coming out of the tar sands itself, where all these pipelines are coming from, right? So Mni Wiconi, water is life. As much as it reaches into the past as a future-oriented project, it forces some to confront their own unbelonging to the land and the river. How can settler society, which possesses no fundamental ethical relationship to the land or its original people, imagine a future premised on justice? There is no simple answer. But whatever the answer may be, Indigenous peoples must lead the way. Our history and long traditions of Indigenous resistance provide possibilities for a future premised on justice. After all, Indigenous resistance is animated by our ancestors' refusal to be forgotten, and it is our resolute refusal to forget our ancestors and our history that animates our visions for liberation. Indigenous revolutionaries are the ancestors from the before and the already forthcoming. But perhaps the ancestors lie within the kinship relations between indigenous and non-indigenous in the lands we both inhabit. There is a capaciousness to indigenous ways of relating that goes beyond the human and fundamentally differs from the heteronuclear family or the biological family. Making kin is to make people into familiars in order to relate, writes Dakota scholar Kim Tallbear. This seems fundamentally different from negotiating relations between those who are seen as different, between sovereigns or nations, especially when one of those nations is a militarized white supremacist empire, she writes. The water protectors also ask us, what does water want from us? What does the earth want from us? Mni Wiconi, water is life, exists outside the logic of capitalism. And whereas past revolutionary struggles have strived for the emancipation of labor from capital, we are challenged not just to imagine, but to demand the emancipation of earth from capital. For the earth to live, capitalism must die. Hichitu, Willow.
We have time for two questions. Suppose there's another class here at 1:30, so we do have to leave by then. But does anyone have a question or?
Yeah.
With the location of Standing Rock, you had Fort Berthold, the surrounding reservations. It seemed like the people in Fort Berthold were almost like bored or something like that because of their exploration. Like what was the outcome of that? Pension and is there, and the follow-up, right?
So, Zaisha Grinnell, who was a youth leader, and somebody that my colleague Jaskier and Dillon, who we both know, interviewed, actually organized a petition to the tribal council to oppose the Dakota Access Pipeline. And she successfully did it, and they passed a resolution. And then later, Fort Berthold came and allied itself with Standing Rock because they recognized the oil actually flowing from that pipeline was being transported from their oil wells, right? So they opposed the route of the pipeline upstream of Standing Rock, and they asked for it to be rerouted, but they didn't actually oppose like the pipeline itself, which, you know, I tried to talk about that a little bit, like thinking about understanding these communities like Fort Berthold, who had 94% of its agricultural lands destroyed, never fully recovered from the dam project, and then the only economic opportunity that comes along is oil and gas. And can we really blame them for going down that route? You know, we may not agree with it, and I think they recognize that like it actually jeopardizes people downriver from them, but they're kind of in it, and it's rolling, and it's almost, you know, they've suffered kind of the harshest consequences of the gas boom because it's all surrounding them too. And it's you know, I talk about this in the book and how it really upset their jurisdiction because you had non-natives who were coming on and off the reservation because, you know, it was a federal jurisdiction, and when they would commit crimes on the reservation, like targeting particularly women and young girls, that the tribe itself couldn't prosecute them because they're non-natives, right? But this large influx of man camps of just primarily men created havoc, you know, in the community itself. Any other questions?
Just maybe more of a comment. My understanding is that line 3 will be passing through the southwest part of our province. And my understanding is that some of the First Nations are on board with that, so that negotiation has been happening, but as far as I know, there's been no public discourse or opportunity for people to respond to it.
I mean, just a quick note in the book, I talk about how our tribe, Lower Brule, signed an agreement with TransCanada for the Keystone XL pipeline. and it pitted the grassroots community against the tribal council. But Standing Rock really galvanized our communities to oppose these pipelines, and so out of it, Lower Brule passed a resolution opposing the Keystone XL and also the Dakota Access. One
more question.
Sure.
I think it's really important because what happened at Standing Rock will soon face up here in Canada. With the pipelines and the tar sands. And what can we learn from that experience at Standing Rock, what we can apply to coming up, like when you see with the Trans-Canada Mountain Pipeline, how the BC First Nations are very effective in stopping that. So what can we expect?
I think one thing that kind of got ignored was the success of the solidarity movements outside the camps themselves. And like in Chicago, the Native community organized a rally, brought out thousands. And I don't know in recent history that there was ever a Native-led protest, right? But it was also extremely successful because they had much more reach with the media. And I think with like the Wet'suwet'en, there was this expectation that they were going to go toe-to-toe with RCMP, right? And they didn't. They turned it into a solidarity campaign, right? And I think we can't be wedded to a certain tactic just because some people want to be heroes, which is good, but thinking about solidarity and building solidarity networks, because also these communities, like right now we're facing the Keystone XL pipeline, and do we really want to externalize all of that, all the issues that come with coming with camps onto communities that don't have any infrastructure in the first place anyways? Because that's kind of one of the lessons that was learned after Standing Rock, is that this community was already hard hit, and then had to take on the burden of, even though they took it on, willingly, they made that choice, but it created issues, and I think those are things to always consider, and to think about places like, I start the book off with the action that happened in Bismarck, where we took the movement to those white spaces and really made them uncomfortable and say, hey, look, but also inviting those potential allies into the struggle as well. And I think right now that's what we're really working on with Keystone XL, is thinking about how do we mobilize in these other areas where they don't want us to be, at the state capitals and in these white dominated border towns, instead of just, because they want us to be out on the land, because they know they can kind of bottleneck all of our struggle there, and they can cut us off. That's what happened at Standing Rock. They shut down all the roads and cut them off economically. It was like an economic embargo. So I think those are one of the lessons, a big lesson, like looking at the success of, it wasn't really a success, but the strategy of the Wet'suwet'en against that pipeline. After they evicted the camps, they got violently evicted, but strategically tactically it was stupid to engage them, like in a firefight, right? That was never their intention. It was a healing center. So I think thinking different ways and different tactics is always important.
If there's no other comments or questions, I just want to say on behalf of the Division of Social Accountability, a huge thank you to Nick. I think you've given us a lot to reflect on here in so-called Canada. And there's many parallels and lessons to be learned. And thank you for your wisdom and for the wisdom of your ancestors. I think it's very profound. So thank you. A reminder, he's speaking tonight at Station 20. And then as well, just a quick note, there's another event next week on March 21st with Aboriginal scholar from Australia. He won't be here in person, but he'll send a recording. And so you might want to check that out as well. So yeah, if we could just give another